We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. This is the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence. It continues, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. In other words, when the American government isn't ensuring the freedom of its people, the people are free to make changes. One of the ways we make change is through voting. The right to vote in the United States has always been in question. Most Americans have not been legally allowed to vote for much of the nation's history. Suffrage is another word for enfranchisement, or a social group's right to vote. On the other hand, disenfranchisement is the act of taking this right away. Without the right to vote, people have no say in their government's policies. These policies affect every aspect of American life, from schooling, to housing, to jobs, to the environment in which people live. In this series of videos, we will explore the history of Black voting rights in Oberlin and Ohio. This journey is a long one, and it revolves around brave activists who recognized that they were being treated unfairly and came together to change their conditions. The original U.S. Constitution didn't say much about voting, so each state decided who was allowed to vote in their own constitution. While every state had different rules, most of them, including Ohio, only allowed white men to vote. When Ohio was drafting its first constitution in 1802, the proposal to grant suffrage to Black men only lost by a single vote. This shows that there was still significant support for Black rights early in the state's history. Some Black people challenged these laws and voted anyway. William Newman, a preacher who studied at Oberlin College after escaping from slavery in Virginia, voted before it was legal to do so. Most people in Oberlin didn't really care about enforcing the Ohio Constitution's voting restriction, and many of them supported Newman and others enough to turn a blind eye. In 1842, it became legal for mixed-race Black people to vote in Ohio. This was the result of a court case in which a farmer from southern Ohio named Edwin Thacker argued that he should be allowed to vote because he was only 1/4 Black. Most American lawmakers at the time believed in the one-drop rule, or that anyone with any African ancestry should be considered and treated as Black. But Edwin's case, Thacker v. Hawk, concluded that people who were more white than they were Black, so over 50%, were legally white and therefore allowed to vote. Shortly after this, John Ramsey cast his ballot, becoming the first Black person to legally vote in Oberlin. He was challenged in court by some Oberlin officials who claimed that he wasn't actually mixed race to stop him from voting. A crowd of supporters formed in the courtroom to cheer him on, and the officials backed off. While Thacker v. Hawk opened the doors for men like John Ramsey to vote, it's hard to say that the ruling was a success for the Black suffrage movement as a whole. The ruling was still based on the idea that a person was more deserving of rights the closer they were to whiteness. This ideology of white supremacy was and is deeply embedded within American society. However, Thacker's court case showed that long before the Civil War, Black people in Ohio and Oberlin were fighting against the laws restricting their rights and freedoms. In the early 19th century, in addition to not being allowed to vote, Black people in Ohio also couldn't hold office or be elected to government, defend themselves in court, serve in the army, or enroll in public schools. This was the result of Black codes, also known as Black laws, which were laws passed by most northern states that controlled the lives of free Black people. Ohio passed 2 rounds of Black codes in 1804 and 1807. Because of these restrictions, Black Ohioans were much more vulnerable to racist laws and people. In June of 1829, a Cincinnati newspaper warned that the city would start enforcing the Black codes. Enforcing these laws hadn't been a priority before, so many Black families in Cincinnati hadn't paid the fine needed to live there. But why did people suddenly start caring now? Over the past few years, many Black people had migrated to Cincinnati. This sparked competition over jobs and resentment from the city's white residents. The resulting crackdown on the Black codes inspired a surge of racial violence. White mobs attacked Black residents and destroyed their businesses, homes, and neighborhoods. More than half of the Black people living in Cincinnati fled from the violence. In the next year, Black leaders from all over the United States met in Philadelphia at a convention to discuss the mobs in Cincinnati, the Black codes, and other issues affecting Black people in America. To fight against laws like the Black codes, they needed to address government officials, white voters, and the Black community with a strong, unified message. This message was discussed, written, and sent out at Black conventions, which at the time were known as colored conventions. This Philadelphia convention started a national movement, as hundreds of Black conventions were organized around the United States throughout the 19th century. But the state of Ohio held the most frequent and most dedicated state conventions in the country. Through these conventions, Black activists created spaces to discuss internal and external activism. Their internal activism focused on uniting and uplifting the Black community from within through education, career development, and spreading knowledge and good values. Their external activism focused on laws and systems that restricted the rights of Black people, like slavery, segregation, and disenfranchisement. The Black codes continued to be a topic of discussion in conventions. In 1849, Charles H. Langston, a prominent leader of the Black conventions, called for a gathering in Columbus to rally people against the Black codes. Charles and his older brother Gideon were the first African Americans to enroll in Oberlin College back in 1835. At this 1849 convention, William H. Day, a journalist from Oberlin, read out a statement from the women present there. Women were usually allowed to attend conventions, but were barred from speaking. They wrote, "We the ladies have been deprived of a voice, which we the ladies deem wrong and shameful." John Watson, a formerly enslaved man who later opened a grocery store in Oberlin, followed up by encouraging the convention's leaders to allow women to participate. The convention agreed that women had the right to speak their minds freely just as men did. Through bravery and cooperation, women at this convention made their voices heard at a time when Black women were often shut out of political organizations. The convention appointed William Day to speak to a group of Ohio legislators about the Black codes. This was the first time a Black person had addressed legislators like this, and Day's speech was praised by activists throughout America. Charles Langston and William Day also helped write an address to the people of Ohio at the convention, which was published in local newspapers. This article persuaded citizens that the Black codes went against both the laws and the moral values of the United States. They wrote, "We are coming for our rights, coming through the Constitution, coming through the law, and relying upon God and the justice of our cause." This reflected the views of many Oberlin graduates and convention members at the time, that the country could be made safer for Black people through politics. These people were called political abolitionists, abolitionists meaning someone who was against slavery. They discussed which political parties Black people should support and how to support them without being able to vote. For example, by talking to lawmakers, communicating with voters through newspapers, and signing petitions. William Day's speech to the legislators convinced them to repeal most of the Black codes later in 1849. After this, voting rights became the top priority for the Black conventions. In 1851, Ohio lawmakers met at a convention held to rewrite the state constitution. While this was taking place, Black Ohioans met in Columbus at their own convention. Day and Langston helped write an address to the Ohio Constitutional Convention asking the lawmakers there to allow Black men to vote in the new state constitution. Here's what they wrote. All men, not a part of men, but all men are created equal. The government which does not protect the rights of all men is not just. We look to you to give us our rights, for we ask nothing more. In spite of much heated debate, Ohio legislators still voted against putting Black suffrage in the state constitution. While this was discouraging, the activists continued their work. A year later, at another Black convention, William Day founded his own newspaper, The Alien American. In its first issue, Day explained the paper's name. The state and national governments have not only disenfranchised, they have ostracized, have made Black people aliens. In other words, racial inequality set Black people apart from the rest of America. The Alien American and other local newspapers published the speeches of Black conventions, spreading their ideas to the people. While the Black conventions didn't end up achieving all of their larger goals, these gatherings and their leaders inspired people to talk about politics around the country. In 1863, Charles Langston moved to Kansas to support the fight for the vote there. A few years later, William Day moved to Delaware to help Black men register to vote after the passing of the 15th Amendment. Conventions continued to take place long after the achievement of Black male suffrage, as leaders like Langston and Day encouraged people to support Black political rights through their words, writing, and teaching. Following the end of the American Civil War in 1865, the United States ratified the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which made slavery illegal except as punishment for a crime. But what happened next? About 12% of the American people were freed from slavery with no land, no education, and no money. The South and the North were still divided, plenty of people in the South didn't want to follow the 13th Amendment, and Black people still weren't treated equally under the law. The period between 1865 and 1877 of rebuilding America after the Civil War is called the Reconstruction era. During this time, Republicans, the party that mostly opposed slavery, made up most of the federal government. Because of this, they were able to pass laws that granted more rights to Black people, even though Democratic state governments were still against them. After the 13th Amendment was passed, abolitionists in Oberlin and throughout the North called for Black people in the South to be allowed to vote. Most Black people in America lived in the South, where they were vulnerable to racist Southern state governments after being freed from slavery. In the North, activists met at conventions to discuss how to work towards Black political rights. An organization called the National Equal Rights League developed out of these conventions. The first president of the National Equal Rights League was John Mercer Langston, Charles Langston's younger brother, a fellow Oberlin graduate, and one of the first Black people to hold office in the United States. At its first meeting, the National Equal Rights League proposed an amendment to the Constitution, that there shall be no legislation within the limits of the United States and territories against any of the inhabitants on account of race or color. In other words, they pledged to make it illegal for laws to discriminate based on race. While this amendment was never adopted, the proposal shows that Black activists were looking to the Constitution to protect their political rights after the Civil War. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 forced Southern states to grant suffrage to Black men. However, the lawmakers and citizens of the Northern states were still split. During the same year, Ohio voted against putting Black suffrage in its state constitution again. In 1868, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which made all people born in the United States American citizens and protected equally by the law. While voting is one of the rights of citizens today, that wasn't the case back then. The 14th Amendment still allowed for states to restrict suffrage. In 1870, after intense debate in the federal and state governments, the 15th Amendment was passed. It read, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Each state had to individually sign on to the 15th Amendment, and Ohio lawmakers had one of the most vicious fights over the amendment in the whole country. Northern Ohio was more supportive, but Southern Ohio leaned more towards the policies and values of the Democratic Party, which were against black suffrage. After a week-long debate, with legislators shouting at each other and national officials writing in to persuade people to vote in their favor, the 15th Amendment was ratified in Ohio in January of 1970 by a close vote of 55 to 57. After the 15th Amendment was passed, the federal government made laws to support it. The Enforcement Act of 1870 made it illegal to bar black men from voting. Additionally, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was passed to ban discrimination in places like hotels and trains. This bill was co-written by John Mercer Langston. In 1888, Langston was elected to Congress in Virginia, where he worked to protect black people from discrimination through politics at a time when most black people were still being excluded from the field. He also helped others take the same path he did. For example, he mentored O.S.B. Wall, a black shoemaker from Oberlin who later became his brother-in-law. Wall became a prominent lawyer, activist, and politician as well. Langston's Civil Rights Act of 1875 was the last major law passed during the Reconstruction era. Afterwards, due to growing pressure from white supremacists, the Supreme Court began to challenge and change these laws, protecting the right to segregate and discriminate. The period after the Reconstruction era, when rights were slowly taken back away from black people, is called the Jim Crow era. Black men had gained citizenship and the right to vote, or at least they had on paper. But they still didn't have the right to participate in society freely without the fear of discrimination or violence. While the 15th Amendment was a huge success for black activists in America, there were many marginalized groups that would have to continue to fight for their suffrage for decades. Women, black and white, wouldn't be allowed to vote until the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. Native Americans and Asian Americans wouldn't gain suffrage until much later, and residents of the U.S. territories like Puerto Rico still aren't able to vote in presidential elections. Alongside the black suffrage movement, a women's suffrage movement was also growing in the 1840s and 50s. Like abolitionists, they used conventions to discuss the fight for equal rights. In fact, many women's suffrage activists were also abolitionists, including Oberlin graduates Lucy Stone and Betsy Mix Cowles. After the 15th Amendment was passed, many black abolitionists and white women's suffrage activists officially cut ties with each other over the long-standing argument of whether black men or white women deserved the right to vote first. The sexism of the black suffrage movement and the racism of the women's suffrage movement meant that black women weren't fully welcomed anywhere. Mary Church Terrell, Oberlin graduate and prominent activist, worked closely with women's suffrage organizations even as she faced racism from within them. While the 15th Amendment had made it illegal to bar Black people from voting, Southern state governments used loopholes to make it much harder to vote. Formerly enslaved people had little access to school or property, so some states adjusted their voting qualifications to be based on access to education and money. Literacy tests were reading and writing tests that some states required people to pass in order to vote. White people were usually graded with less scrutiny, given easier tests, or not tested at all. Poll taxes required people to pay an extra fee to vote. On top of this, some states passed what is known as a grandfather clause, which made it so that if your grandfather could legally vote during his time, which was only true for white men, you didn't need to jump through those hoops. Voter intimidation was used to stop Black people from voting in most states. Racist individuals and groups would threaten Black voters with violence to scare them away from voting. Laws like the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which defended Black people from racial discrimination, were dismantled by the Supreme Court. This meant that after 1877, there weren't protections against racial discrimination by states or individuals anymore, which made it easier to use literacy tests, poll taxes, and voter intimidation at the polls. These had massive effects. In the southern states, very few Black people were registered to vote until the 1960s. Black women faced the barriers of being Black and the barriers of being women when trying to vote, even after the 19th Amendment granted their suffrage. Mary Church Terrell shared this worry with a friend shortly after the 19th Amendment was passed, saying, "The colored women of the South will be shamefully treated and will not be allowed to vote, I am sure." Literacy tests and poll taxes were mostly only passed in southern states. However, the entire country was slipping into the Jim Crow era. Following Reconstruction, Oberlin started what Mary Church Terrell called a heartbreaking backsliding in racial tolerance. Many of the earliest and strongest voices in support for Black rights left Oberlin to follow opportunities elsewhere, or they stopped supporting the college in protest after experiencing racism there from students and townspeople. The community became increasingly segregated, and fewer Black residents were elected to office. The strong racial justice culture of Oberlin was fading. Literacy tests and poll taxes wouldn't fully be banned until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed in response to the Civil Rights Movement. But in 2013, the Supreme Court removed a section of the Voting Rights Act, making it legal again for states to place certain restrictions on who can vote. For example, in 2024, a law was passed in Ohio that required people to carry a specific ID card to vote. Like the literacy tests and poll taxes of the past, this disproportionately affects people of color, who are much less likely than white people to have this ID given the resources and money it takes to obtain one. The fight for Black voting rights has been ongoing for over 200 years, from before the 15th Amendment to long after it. Oberlin graduates and townspeople have spoken up about the importance of the right to vote, and spent time and effort fighting against people that restricted voting rights to keep themselves in power. These activists knew that voting was never a given. They knew that without action, there are no mass movements, and without movement, there is no change. They also knew how important education was to guaranteeing their rights and spreading their message. They were teachers, students, public speakers, and journalists. By learning about them and learning from them, we can begin to understand how each and every one of us can carry on their legacy today.